Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something I know you're interested in, the film Forrest Gump,
Okay.
and specifically how this film portrays mental retardation.
Uh-huh.
No, we'll be using a paper, Mental Retardation, the movie Forrest Gump, as our guide for this deep dive.
Right.
And, we're not here to do a full-on movie review.
Gotcha.
We really want to kind of dig into the analysis that this paper presents and see, how the film goes about portraying this complex topic and how Forrest navigates all the various social barriers and situations that come up in the film with his disability.
Yeah, it's interesting. This film definitely got people talking about how mental retardation, is shown on screen.
Yeah.
So before we even jump into the movie itself,
Yeah.
maybe we should define what we're even talking about.
Yeah, the terminology can be a little bit tricky.
Yeah, so the paper, it uses the World Health Organization's definition of mental retardation, which basically says it's a condition that affects someone's intellectual abilities
Okay.
and their adaptive behaviors, things like learning and problem solving, social skills.
I see.
All that.
So, how does this translate to what we see in the film? We all know Forrest, but what are some specific examples that really show these characteristics?
Oh, there's tons.
Yeah.
Just think about his speech, right? How slow and deliberate he talks. Or remember when he needed those leg braces as a kid?
Mm-hmm.
The film, it uses these visual things to represent those developmental challenges.
Right.
And then, you also have the way he sometimes just totally misinterprets social situations.
Yeah.
And that points to the social and communication aspects of his condition.
It makes you wonder, how much of Forrest's social isolation was, directly because of the condition itself, the disability, and how much of it came from, the reactions of other people.
Oh, that's a great point. Remember that scene on the bus?
Which one?
Where he's talking to
Yeah.
those that older couple.
Yeah, where he only has Jenny as a friend.
Exactly. He tells them Jenny's his only friend.
Yeah.
And I think that scene, it really it captures that loneliness.
Right.
That social exclusion that a lot of people with disabilities experience, and it shapes how they see themselves even from when they're young.
Absolutely. It really makes you think about those early experiences and how much they stay with you.
Yeah.
So, we see Forrest trying to fit in, facing bullying and all that prejudice.
Right.
But then there's this big change.
Yeah.
When he joins the Army.
The Army. Yeah.
This super disciplined, strict environment.
Right.
And oddly enough.
This is where he thrives.
Exactly. It's this unexpected haven for him.
It is interesting, isn't it?
It is.
You have this world that's all about rules and structure.
Mm-hmm.
And it's where those things that made him an outsider before they kind of become his strength.
Totally. The source material actually argues that in this context,
In the Army.
yeah, his mental retardation almost becomes a benefit, an asset.
Yeah, and the paper highlights that. Forrest, he's great at just following orders, no questions asked. And when things get dangerous, he doesn't overthink it.
Right.
He just acts. And in combat, well, that can be a real advantage.
When he runs straight into enemy territory to save his buddies.
Exactly.
It's shown as this heroic act, but it makes you wonder if in real life,
right,
that same, that impulsivity could actually be dangerous in other situations.
It's true. It's a tricky thing.
Yep.
The film, it's a great story, but I'm not sure it really shows how complicated it is for people with mental retardation in the real world.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to work and stuff.
Right. But it does kind of make you think about what success even means.
Oh, absolutely.
It challenges those ideas.
Yeah.
About ability and disability and how, society views those things.
And speaking of those societal norms, the film takes some liberties, when it comes to how Forrest navigates the world, especially as an adult.
Yeah, totally.
He doesn't seem to face any real barriers.
Right.
He becomes a war hero, a ping pong champ, a successsuccessful businessman. It's
it's pretty unbelievable.
yeah, it's a little fantastical, right?
Right.
And, what the source is saying is it's likely intentional.
Okay.
The film's using this exaggeration to say something.
So you mean, by showing this so-called village idiot achieving all this stuff,
Right.
it's they're making a point about what society thinks of as normal.
Exactly.
And what we see as success.
The paper dives into this idea,
Yeah.
arguing that Forrest Gump, it's not trying to be realistic, when it comes to how his life unfolds. Instead, it's using this this crazy level of success to make us think about deeper issues, like what really matters.
Oh, it's less about like a super accurate picture of mental retardation
Right?
and more about sparking a conversation about how we see intelligence, achievement, and even like what a good life is.
Yeah, yeah. Forrest Gump, it might not get everything right,
Hmm.
but it definitely makes you think about those things.
Absolutely.
Societal norms and expectations and all that.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about Forrest's time in the Army.
Right.
But what about the Army's actual stance on disability? Like, the paper mentioned the U.S. Army's commitment to equal opportunities.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
Yeah,
The film shows this kind of fantastical version of Forrest's experience,
right.
but it does touch on something real.
So how does that commitment actually play out in real life?
Well, there's actual laws in place,
Oh, okay.
going all the way back to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973,
Yep.
which basically guarantees people with disabilities
Mhm.
have the same opportunities in the military.
So the film,
Mm-hmm.
even though it takes some liberties,
Sure.
it actually kind of highlights this real commitment to inclusion.
Yeah, it's an interesting contrast.
It is, yeah, it's kind of cool.
The fantastical and the real coming together.
This deep dive is making me see Forrest Gump in a totally different way. It's definitely not as simple as it seems on the surface, you know?
Yeah, not
Like a mix of social commentary, heartwarming moments, and, of course, some good old Hollywood storytelling.
And that's why it's so interesting to really analyze it.
Exactly.
It's a film that keeps sparking debate and makes us look at things from different angles, even all these years later.
We've really just scratched the surface, haven't we?
We have.
There's so much more to unpack,
Oh, yeah.
both in the film itself and in the bigger conversation about, disability and how it's represented.
Right.
Well, we're going to pick this back up after a quick break, so stay tuned. We'll be diving even deeper into Forrest Gump, exploring the film's message and its impact on how we view mental retardation. So before the break, we were talking about how Forrest finds so much success as an adult,
Right.
which, doesn't quite match reality.
Yeah, it is kind of an idealized view.
Right, and the paper suggested the filmmakers might be doing this on purpose.
Yeah, it's like they're using this almost absurd level of success to make us question our own values.
Like what we think of as achievement and all that.
Exactly. Do we really value outward success, those medals and trophies, or is there something deeper
Right. So it's interesting.
that makes you think about the messages we get about what it means to make it in life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the film really pushes that idea.
Yeah.
Forrest ends up achieving more than a lot of the characters who are considered normal.
It really flips things on their head.
Totally.
Like, think about Lieutenant Dan.
Oh, yeah. Good example.
He's so focused on his legacy, all that family history.
And he's bitter.
Yeah.
At first he sees Forrest as a burden, but then
through Forrest,
right, through his optimism, his simple way of looking at things,
yeah,
Dan finds peace.
it's like Forrest because he's so innocent
Huh.
and he doesn't get bogged down by all those, societal pressures.
Mhm.
He just navigates life without all that cynicism.
He doesn't chase success, it just finds him.
Yeah, and maybe that's what the filmmakers are getting at.
It could be.
Like, real happiness is about appreciating the little things.
Enjoying the moment.
Exactly, not getting caught up in all the big, complicated stuff.
And Forrest, he embodies that throughout the whole movie.
So, in a way, the film challenges us to think differently about, what a good life even means.
It does. It says, hey, maybe there's more than one way to find fulfillment.
And maybe we shouldn't be so quick to judge people based on their limitations.
Exactly. We might miss out on their unique gifts, their potential.
Earlier, we were talking about the U.S. Army and their commitment to equal opportunities.
Right.
And it's interesting how the film, even though it's a bit fantastical,
Yeah.
it touches on this real-world effort for inclusion.
Absolutely. And the Rehabilitation Act of 1973,
Mhm.
that's a real turning point in how we view the rights of people with disabilities.
Can you tell us a bit more about that act and, how it changed things?
So it basically outlawed discrimination against people with disabilities
Wow.
in anything that got federal funding. So that's jobs, education, even transportation.
It's a big deal.
Yeah, and it paved the way for even bigger changes later on, like the Americans with Disabilities Act.
So even though the film stretches the truth a bit,
For sure.
it kind of shines a light on this movement towards inclusion.
Yeah, and specifically within the military, which is cool.
This deep dive has really made me appreciate how layered Forrest Gump is.
Me too.
It's not just a simple, heartwarming story, It makes you think critically about disability, how society views it, and how we define success.
And it keeps you entertained while doing it.
Right. Which is like the magic of good storytelling.
Absolutely.
But one thing that's been on my mind is
Yeah.
how Forrest, as an adult, doesn't seem to encounter any real social barriers.
Oh, right?
That's not very realistic, is it?
No, not really.
Like, in the real world,
Mm.
people with mental retardation face all sorts of challenges.
Oh, definitely. When it comes to education, finding a job, being accepted by others.
So why do you think the filmmakers made that choice? To show Forrest's life as so easy?
Well, it could be they wanted to create a really positive, uplifting story.
One where he overcomes everything.
Exactly. To focus on his resilience and how he beats the odds.
Okay, I can see that.
But it could also be a more subtle way of pointing out the real struggles that people with disabilities face.
By showing what could be, they're highlighting what often isn't.
It's a way to make us think without being too preachy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It sparks conversation.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to Forrest Gump.
It's amazing how much there is to uncover, isn't it?
It is. Despite its flaws, it really makes you think about important things.
Yeah. Disability, perceptions, what makes a good life, it's all there.
So if we had to sum up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what would you say are the key takeaways for our listeners?
I'd say remember that Forrest Gump is just one story. It's not the whole picture.
Right.
It's important to look at how the media portrays disability, to be critical.
And to ask ourselves, is this realistic?
Exactly. Is it nuanced? Does it promote understanding? Or does it rely on harmful stereotypes?
And we should also look at our own attitudes and biases, right?
Absolutely. How do we treat people with disabilities in our own lives?
It's all connected.
It is, because representation matters.
The stories we tell,
Mm-hmm.
the images we create, they shape how we see the world.
And we have a responsibility to challenge those stories when they're harmful.
And to demand better, more accurate portrayals.
Yeah, so people understand.
Forrest Gump may not be perfect, but it started a lot of important conversations.
It has, about disability, about inclusion.
And it makes us question our own views.
And maybe that's its greatest strength.
Before we wrap things up,
Yeah.
I want to leave our listener with a final thought.
Go ahead.
This deep dive, it was all about a film you're interested in.
Right.
We talked about mental retardation, those social barriers, how Forrest defies expectations.
Mm-hmm.
But the big question is, does this film, even with its flaws,
Yeah.
make you rethink how society views disability? Does it challenge you to see the limitations we put on others and maybe even ourselves?
That's a really powerful question to think about.
That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Forrest Gump. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Forrest Gump. It's been a fascinating journey right now.
It has. It really has. We've gone deep into this story that seems so simple at first glance.
Yeah, exactly. And,
Yeah.
we've seen its strengths, its weaknesses, those moments where it really hits the mark and those where it kind of leans into those Hollywood tropes.
Right. Right. And I think that mix of realism and fantasy is what makes Forrest Gump so interesting to analyze.
Yeah, it definitely gets people talking and makes you question your assumptions.
For sure. And in the end, it leaves us with more questions than answers, doesn't it?
It does. One thing that's really stayed with me is this idea that the film, even though it doesn't always nail the portrayal of mental retardation, uses Forrest's journey
Yeah.
to say something bigger about how society views things.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. It's like they're using his success, this unlikely success, to highlight those limitations that we put on people, sometimes without even realizing it.
And he navigates a world that often doesn't value or understand people with disabilities.
Exactly.
And he thrives in a way.
It's almost like the filmmakers are saying, look, if Forrest can do all of this with everything he's up against, what does that say about the potential we all have? Yeah.
Regardless of how we see ourselves or how others see us.
It's a powerful message.
It is.
And I think it's one that people still connect with today.
It makes you question those labels and those stereotypes and see the worth in everyone.
So as we wrap up, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, it's important to remember that Forrest Gump is just one story, one perspective.
Right.
It doesn't represent everyone's experience.
And we should always look at how the media portrays disability with a critical eye.
Yeah. Ask yourself, is this realistic?
Does it promote understanding?
Is it nuanced or does it just use harmful stereotypes?
Then maybe most importantly, we should all look inward.
Yeah, at our own biases.
Yeah, how do we see and treat people with disabilities in our everyday lives?
It's about creating a more inclusive world.
Because representation matters.
Yeah.
The stories we choose to tell.
the images we put out there.
They shape how we understand the world.
And if we see harmful representations, we got to speak up,
Demand something better. More accurate. More real.
Forrest Gump might not be perfect, but it definitely got the conversation started.
It did.
It's a film that makes you think, even if it's not always spot on.
And it shows us that real happiness, true fulfillment, can come from unexpected places.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's those perceived limitations that actually become our strengths.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into Forrest Gump. We hope this gave you some new insights into the film.
Yeah, and how it portrays mental retardation.
And remember, this is just the start. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
There's so much more out there to discover.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time.